So I will now introduce you to Chris Griffin. Chris is Chair of the Consultative Forum, our Sustainability Consultative Forum, and also Chair of the Steering Group. And a number of you will know Chris from being part of the Sustainability Consultative Forum over the last few years. So Chris, if you're there, if you'd like to say a few words. So I can't quite see you at the minute. See your phone.
No one can see incognito, Helen. I hope you can hear me. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Excellent. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this somewhat different format for our Sustainability Consultative Forum. It's obviously due to COVID-19, we've taken on this format. This is the first of a number of webinars that we will be conducting, and from the calibre of the speakers we've got today, I think we've started off with a real bang, and I hope people do get heavily involved in the question side. I think I'm a little bit even stifled in that space myself as far as trying to get a question in, so we'll see how it goes. But I'm sure, given the discussions we've had over the last 8 or so years of workshops, I'm sure there'll be many and varied questions coming forward. There's not much more for me to say. I think you'll hear from me again towards the end, but welcome. Let's hope we get a lot out of these sessions, and hopefully everyone can hear and manage the technology a little bit better than I have. But I'll hand back to Helen now to introduce the first of our speakers. Thanks, Helen.
Thanks very much, Chris. And as Chris said, this is our first webinar in a series of 6 that we're going to be hosting over the next couple of months. And so this one is really trying to set the scene, the big picture, and we talk about a brave new world. We're all, I guess, have different experiences of COVID-19 and all perhaps thinking different perspectives on where to next. So this is an opportunity for us to actually start to think about what's happening in the broader space and what are the likely implications for us into the future. So I'd now like to introduce Sam Mostyn, who's going to be our first speaker to talk about COVID-19, a major disruptor, any key learnings for us. And Sam is a non-executive director and sustainability advisor and sits on a number of boards. She's previously held senior roles with IAG, Optus, Cable and Wireless, and is a member of the board of the Australia Council for the Arts and deputy chair of the Diversity Council of Australia. So having been one of the first women appointed to be an AFL commissioner, she comes with a strong history of leading the way in many areas. So we're taking this opportunity to have Sam tell us her views of what she's seeing and where she sees things going. So thanks very much, Sam.
Thanks so much, Helen, and thank you to you and Chris for inviting me to join you today with your industry. And it's really marvellous to be alongside Melanie today to kick off your series of presentations through COVID. My caveat is that I don't have a background in food and dairy and land management, but I've tried to tailor my comments so that I come at it from a particular perspective, but I'm deeply invested in, and as a customer, I'm deeply engaged with your work. I thought, Helen, just to kick off, given that people are joining us from all around the country, and today marks the commencement of National Reconciliation Week, and yesterday we commemorated National Sorry Day and the 3rd anniversary of the Uluru Statement from the Heart. I just thought I would acknowledge that we're all meeting on very different lands around the country, and pay our respects to the traditional owners and their elders, past and present, as we discuss things that happen on our land around the country today. As I said, I can only really start by complimenting the industry and the work you've already done as an industry with your stakeholders and others who you've worked with over many years to build a sustainability framework. The kinds of commitments and priorities you've already declared that the industry is engaged with is incredibly impressive. The fact that the SDGs are used as part of your reporting and the transparency in the reporting, again, is just really impressive. And you know, I've worked in many industries where it's taken a lot longer to get an engagement with the SDGs and a commitment to going further and sharing that with various stakeholders, as you've done with your various stakeholder engagement groups and with the webinars that you're launching today. So I've been asked to talk about what does COVID-19 mean for commitments and progress with sustainability and the SDGs. And I probably can't add to your experience of this. It is a story of many complex and dramatic parts right now. But I'd hope today to give you an optimistic perspective and leave you with a challenge to build on all this formative and really substantial work you've already done on sustainability, and to take some of the big steps that might lie ahead to secure the dairy industry's longevity and leadership well beyond this crisis and well beyond just your own industry. So a quick look at the big picture from my perspective, and you'll have your own. But many are already calling the COVID-19 crisis a dress rehearsal for sustainability, or even a dress rehearsal for climate change. My friend Paul Gilding, who some of you may know, a long-term environmentalist and a sustainability warrior who spent a lot of time both inside the corporate world, but also agitating from the environmental side, only this week published a new piece on his Cockatoo Chronicles called "It Will Get Darker Before the Dawn." And he argues that the major global crises like COVID accelerate existing megatrends that are already underway, and that without us using humanity's great capacity to act quickly and achieve extraordinary things, that acceleration of the things like income inequality, ocean and land degradation, ecosystem collapses, mass movements of migrants and refugees, famine, civil unrest, nationalism, all the kinds of things that we know to be the kind of megatrends that the world is dealing with, that unless we act, that those kind of rolling, interconnected catastrophes have an enormous impact on our society in a profound and almost unimaginable way. And so that in the absence of deciding to take the lessons of COVID and make different choices about how we might think about leadership, protecting the future, and how we embed transformational sustainability, Paul comes to the conclusion, like many others, I think, where he predicts that there'll be further mega crises triggering much bigger global economic collapses if we choose to ignore this moment to step up and learn from this crisis and act accordingly. He reminds us in the piece that one of the most important things we need to do right now is to understand that COVID-19 is not a singular event, that it's an incredibly dangerous response to think of it as a linear crisis that allows us to take things back to normal. An attitude of that suggesting that COVID is simply a simple linear crisis that will pass into our history and we move on and back to normal. Rather, he, and I agree with him, says we've got to see this as a crisis within the framework of a system, a big complex system with many feedback loops, lots of negative synergies and interconnected consequences because of the way our world is now just so interdependent and connected. And we've seen that with the spread of this virus. Paul actually quotes from a report, a very recent report from the Bank of America, Merrill Lynch, who gave an economic analysis of the pandemic. And I think it gives a really good summary of where we're at. And the bank said, coronavirus is the political, economic and psychological event of our lifetime that will drive disruption and transformation for years to come. It will bring a radical transformation of the kind that occurs only once in a generation. So I agree with that assessment. I think that sort of sets for me the big picture moment that we're living through and will be dealing with long past the actual virus itself. Paul and I both serve on the faculty of the Prince of Wales Business and Sustainability Leadership Program that's run by Cambridge University. And just as COVID was hitting our shores in early March, we were together teaching the Australian course on sustainability leadership down in Victoria, alongside sustainability pioneers Sir Jonathan Porritt and climate change experts like Professor Will Steffen. And we had a number of other social and civil society leaders working with a number of leaders across business and industry to talk about what does sustainability leadership look like at that point. And we hadn't really appreciated in early March that global scale of the COVID virus. We were nonetheless working with all those business leaders over a number of days to look and to help them chart the course with their organisations, with other big shifts that had opened up in Australia, particularly through the bushfires of the summer. And of course, the bushfires was simply the end of a horrific lead up that Australia endured through that period of long-term drought, extreme heat, the smoke and compromised air quality that preceded the fires themselves. And was then, we lived through that horrific time through the fires, and then dealt with the following weeks where there were storms, floods and hail, which caused enormous damage to a number of people outside the bushfire areas. And we learned only this week that the bushfires alone so far have generated over $2 billion worth of insurance claims. And that's just the fire part of that period of our summer. So I think it's fair to say that there was a sense in early March at that time, just as we were coming out of the worst of the fires and those weather events, that there was an opportunity in that moment to take the sad fact that the predictions that had been made by scientists over many previous decades had now landed so horrendously into the lives personally of so many Australians. And with that associated loss of landscape, of biodiversity, flora and fauna, we were already leading into, I think, a different and deeply emotionally lived experience of climate change, probably for the first time, that brought the nation to an understanding of what climate change could be like. And it wasn't just the fires and the direct loss, it was the appreciation of the other things that were a threat to our way of life, but particularly human health and well-being, and a deep grieving, I think, that we took into the COVID environment for the loss of much of our natural environment, a loss of so many of those animals that we saw playing out in real time, in scenes that were just unimaginable, even by those seasoned professionals, the firefighters and the first responders who had seen so much damage in the past. So a lot of important work was felt possible in that moment at the end of the fires, in the summer's aftermath. And I think people felt there might be a chance to change the national policies around some of these issues. But at the same time, as that was all happening, we had also seen really positively a number of years where there'd been some dramatic positive shifts in other players in our society around things like climate change. There were people like investors and banks, large companies, large industries, regulators, central banks, and youth movements and consumers. And I'm sure we'll hear more about consumers from Melanie. But I think it explains why, in part, as we're going into the management of the virus here in Australia and doing that really well, we started to see a number of really significant leaders starting to write about the unique opportunity in Australia that was emerging from the learnings of the summer we'd had and COVID-19, and to put the case to all policymakers and to all of us as a society that this was a time that we could reconceive, reimagine our society, an Australian country, rather than simply accepting that we were going to be returning to something called normal. And as the COVID crisis has continued its journey all across Europe, the US, Brazil, India, and many other countries, we have, of course, seen things that might cause us to worry that the sustainability movement is compromised or stalled at the moment. We've seen the behaviour of some dictators ignoring the health of their citizens. Brazil is a good example of that. The US and the UK have responded slowly. And in the case of the US, we have actually seen some specific examples of a pushback on sustainability and environmental gains, most notably changing the relations of the EPA and its enforcement of environmental protections. And of course, the lower oil price has made looking at renewables less compelling as oil-based products have become cheaper. So on the one hand, you could look at it and say there's been a pushback in some parts of the world, but the optimist in me looks to the fact that despite those short-term headwinds, which I think were expected in a time like this, the COVID crisis has actually generated some of the most important long-term tailwinds for us, particularly here in Australia and New Zealand and parts of East Asia, where we've all managed the actual pandemic so well and are regarded by the rest of the world as having created an extraordinarily healthy response to what has devastated so much of the rest of the world. So we've seen some things that have happened in this time that were previously unthinkable, and they've been dealt with very rapidly and become immediately built into our system. We've had the dramatic shift to us working remotely, as this call shows so clearly. The government moved very quickly to a wage subsidy program, helped advised by the trade union movement. There was the creation of the National Cabinet to solve really big state federal blockages. And the most extraordinary examples of community engagement, investment in our local producers and makers, care for those most in need, and a real elevation of the notion of care and a human-centred approach to how we've been managing ourselves through this period. And we've actually rethought about the value of the caring professions. And that's been a wonderful outcome of this period, I would say. For me, though, COVID has underscored the importance of building long-term resilience and investing in the new capabilities that we'll need to deal with rapidly escalating and colliding scenarios and impacts within this complex system that we're all part of. And importantly, the chance to open up brand new coalitions and create those coalitions and partnerships to deal with the more wicked problems and the interconnected crises which we will continue to face. Essentially, I think this takes a primary role for sustainability leadership and the kind of work you've already started in the dairy industry to elevate the sustainability principles that you've chosen to define the future of the industry and the people in it. Only this week, we've again heard from the Prime Minister that he wants to commit a whole new path to the way we think about industrial relations. He's asked everyone to put down their instruments of anger and to work together to come up with new ideas to actually boost the way Australia will come out of this. We also this morning heard the Agricultural Minister talking about the importance of animal welfare for those sheep that are stranded off the coast of West Australia due to the COVID infection of the members of the transport ship they're on. And to hear a minister talking about animal health and the protection of those animals in that context, I think is showing a change in the way some of the ways we think about these things. And we've seen governments of the country really commit very quickly to looming mental health challenges and by getting ahead of things and putting some big investments into mental health issues, domestic violence and things of that kind. So all those things tell me that there's a great opportunity to continue to commit to sustainability in all of the board meetings I'm attending, whether they are big corporate boards, not-for-profits or think tanks. There's been no slowing down at all on the focus on sustainability efforts and the continuing commitments to those that have already signed up to the SDGs. And although those SDGs can be complex and hard to describe to people, they remain a very good framework and have become even more important, I think, in a post-COVID world. But I think what we've got to take from COVID, and particularly given that you're using the SDGs as part of the framing of your future, is we've got to make those goals feel personal and felt by communities and make them much more human-centred so that the engagement with those goals don't feel like a theoretical global initiative that's foisted upon the country, but are from the ground up felt to be human-centric and about embedding a much more sustainable future. And we've got to use the behavioural sciences more in this way. And I think listening to Melanie and learning from the research on what is moving people is going to be incredibly important. I think what both the climate challenge and the heat challenge over summer and the COVID crisis and our vulnerability as a continent has opened up a path for our commitments to be really embraced through a human lens and through a care lens. And I don't mean that in some kind of altruistic fashion. I mean it as a core business factor. And we're seeing that now being integrated into parts of the system that might not have ordinarily been thought of by you as being driven by some of these big events. So the changes in the banking system, the big banking shifts across the world, there are coalitions of banks now, particularly out of Europe. I'm thinking of ING that now has a program where it's mapping its climate impact and its commitments to the Paris Agreement by actually running an X-ray over its loan portfolio and its mortgages and working with those that it loans to and lends money to actually be better at their commitment to climate change action. I think we're going to see the same on the social side of sustainability, where those that are in the supply chain of supporting industries will actually take advantage of a conversation and partnerships with their consumers and customers to help make that change much more profound and about the full supply chain working together to build these outcomes that help us meet Paris and deal with the post-COVID world. So I think those changes are well underway. They're not new, but they're new in their focus and the speed at which they're operating. And I thought I'd share with you just a conversation I was part of late last week with the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, which is chaired by Jeffrey Sachs out of Columbia University. And it brings together people engaged in sustainability around the world. And at that meeting of about 150 people trying to get a sense of what the future does hold, Peter Backer, who's the Chief Executive of the World Business Council on Sustainable Development, first of all said that the SDGs remain the globe's North Star, that Australia and New Zealand and East Asia remain the focus of where that work can be best done because of our good health reputation, and that there is no such thing as business as usual. He's describing it as business as unusual, and that the food system and the food system supply chain is not only going to be vital in the next 6 to 12 months, but we're going to need a big, big narrative, a common narrative on the production side of how we think about our health, human health, our food systems, our animal productions, as the focus for our time. And I really believe that what's come out of this in terms of your industry is that land health, sustainable land management is going to be increasingly one of the most important focuses of our time. I think we'll move from a direct climate type of concern to looking at those things that sustain us and nourish us as communities, and through this much more human-centred experience of crises and an engagement with the future, and the fact that you all have worked to support the Sustainable Development Goals to date, I think that what lies ahead is actually a really positive path and a new way and a new narrative for sustainable production that builds on what we're learning through these crises, but doesn't think of any one of them as simply avoidable or having been dealt with, but as systemic. So I know there's much innovation in your sector. I'm happy to move to questions, and certainly at the end of the session to do more of that. But I do think it's an important time to remain positive, to take that moment where the community can actually engage with the work you're doing, and human health, the land health, food health, I think will become one of the biggest focus we've got in the sustainability environment, and you're clearly primed to be a leader in that discussion with us as a community. So thanks very much. That was a very quick race through, and very happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Sam, and we just have time for one quick one, and then we'll move on to Melanie and then open up at the end. But Philip asked a question, Sam, that says COVID has highlighted both how vulnerable everyone is and that certain groups sacrifice more than others. I'm just wondering whether going forward, what guiding principles should we follow to determine how sacrifice should be shared across society? Which goes to your people part.
It's a really, really interesting and important question. And I think what we learned through the summer for ourselves and now for COVID is that all of these extreme events exacerbate the existing inequalities that sit inside our communities and our nations. And so the way through, if we're going to reconceive what the future might look like, we've got to be able to deal with those inequalities in a different way. And I think we're beginning to see that at the national level, the way we're getting policy formulation that's having everyone at the table, where previously that was not something I think we would have been confident about. But we've got to build in an equality and a fairness agenda through the way we think about our future. And it goes as far as intergenerational economic equality. Young people have got a stake in this. We've got to bring many, many more people to the table whose existing inequalities have been severely exacerbated. And I don't think we can just rely on the not-for-profit and charitable sector to pick that up. I think we're into a conversation on whether it's going to be a universal basic income or some form of support that helps to alleviate this growing inequality of wealth and opportunity. It's got to be part of that conversation. And I presume that that's something that this industry can be part of because of the connection you have with local communities that would be feeling some of that inequality already. But I think it's an essential part of the thematics of a sustainable future for us.
Thank you very much, Sam, and we will continue the discussion when we move to Q&A later on. And for those of you, there were a couple of questions asked for some information, and thank you to those who have provided information in the chat space if people would like to look there. I'd now like to move to introduce our next speaker, Melanie Norris. So Melanie is an Associate Director at Fresh Analytics with Nielsen, and has used the Nielsen research to guide the fast-moving consumer goods area for information on consumer trends, etc., and what that might mean then for opportunities. She's been quite an expert at fusing the data from a number of sources to provide that holistic view of trends and opportunities within the industry. She's provided perspectives to clients across the total fresh food space, but particularly including dairy, meat, seafood and baconry, and is passionate about seeing health and wellness trends translate into consumers increasing their fresh food consumption. So Melanie, with that, I'm going to hand over to you and allow you to talk to the group, and you will be sharing your screen. Thank you.
Thanks, Helen, and thanks everyone. I'm glad to be here today. Thanks for having me to your webinar. Sam, I liked your talk. It was very interesting. I particularly like what you said about COVID being a dress rehearsal for climate change. Let's just hope that it can perhaps push some of that framework through a bit faster, if that's the case. It was great, thank you. So, hi everyone. for those of you who have visited Bunnings recently, as I did in the weekend, you'll see that the way we shop and what we shop for has changed significantly in the past few months since the advent of COVID-19. Now I'm going to share my screen and stop my video so that we can share that. So Helen, if you could just let me know if you can see the screen, that would be great.
Yes, that's fine. Thank you.
All right. Thanks very much. So we've seen with COVID-19, we've seen this real rise of a homebody economy in Australia. We're now much more accustomed to shopping, studying, working, finding entertainment online at home. Staying at home has become really a new way of life for us here in Australia and around the world, and it's had a big impact on how and what we're eating. So in March and April, we witnessed incredible scenes of shoppers rushing to pack their pantries with enough food staples for a few months. In March, shoppers purchased on average the equivalent of 1 additional week's worth of groceries. They went to the shops 3 times more and packed their pantries with 24 days worth of carbs. We also saw sales of chest freezers spiking in February and March and having those filled with essential staples. So the first demographic groups that reacted to the pandemic in Australia were the Northeast Asian born ethnic groups, and those are people from China, Hong Kong, Macau, Taiwan, Korea and Japan. So it was those demographic group and the older group who started pantry stocking as early as February, and that was when Wuhan announced its lockdown. Highly affluent shoppers were some of the slowest to react to the crisis, while low affluence households appeared to be increasing their spend in line with the fortnightly pattern, probably in line with their pay cycle. And we did see that toilet paper was not the only product to have supply issues during March and April. We had out of stocks rice, pasta, flour, bread mix, and our Asian and Indian ingredients, again signaling this return to home cooking and baking. Now you might think that with the restrictions, frequency of going to the shops would actually decrease, but we noticed in March that it increased as out of stocks became more apparent. People were struggling to purchase what they thought they needed, and also shopping was a sanctioned activity that they could do, so going to the shops became a highlight of the day for many. I noted for me. Health and hygiene in store became quite paramount to shoppers, and we saw a lot of changes from retailers there. We saw packaged products driving 80% of the growth of total grocery, but fresh products weren't left behind. They also grew about 3 times more than average. And shopping local, we're permitted, and online shopping also, we saw a great increase in. And online shopping was an interesting one actually, because we would have expected that to increase dramatically, but really this was an area where the supply chain let us down and often orders were not able to be fulfilled. So there was great demand for online shopping, but in terms of actual sales, they weren't able to fulfill a whole lot of orders. And in terms of consumption changes, that gave rise to this new type of shoppers that we've had. We feel that the shoppers can be broken into 2 specific groups. We've got our insulated spender, who is higher income, they're able to buy what they want and what they need. They haven't had any employment impact. And we have our constrained shoppers, who's predominantly poorer, lower income, has been severely impacted by employment problems and maybe only able to afford the basics. So we want to talk about the shoppers from these 2 points of views. But one thing we noticed as well from a product perspective was that due to all the out of stocks and the wallet pressure for some shoppers, we saw a trial of new alternatives. So they may have traded down to private label products, or they might have just bought what was there on the shelf and what was available. And if those experiences were good for shoppers, then that then becomes the new product they buy. So this brand disloyalty idea is coming through a lot more with the COVID trends. We also saw from a fresh perspective, Longer lasting options were more popular during the peak month. And I guess that's no surprise there. We saw long life milk really spike. We also saw longer life veggies such as potatoes, pumpkin, onion. People were really pantry stocking for those things. And when we talked to shoppers about what was important to them, we saw sustainability and organic coming through as a lower priority now than it has been before. And that's not to say it's not important, but consumers are simply more interested at the moment in more direct health benefits. So natural and local resonating highly with consumers. I want to take a look at retail behaviour and how that changed. So retailers did a great job of working together and working with the community and going for these community shopping hours for our older at-risk shoppers, and things like the basics boxes, which were in collaboration with Australian Post. So they were for people who couldn't get out and about. Retailers also had to put limits on purchasing in many instances for these out of stocks that we were seeing. And we have seen a cancelling of promotions that they're to manage the demands on the supply chain. Cancelling of the promotions has led to an increased average price across total grocery that we've seen in the last couple of months. And it will be interesting to see how that plays out in the future. We know Australia is such a promotionally driven country, but will that change? We really saw an expansion of retailer repertoire particularly in the peak month of purchasing. Typically, people shop at 1 to 2 outlets in a month. During COVID, they shopped at 4+. And I guess the winners of this were the smaller butchers, greengrocers, specialty stores, but also IGA with its huge network of stores really benefited from that and picked up significantly in terms of sales. We saw directed supplier models such as food box and meal kits definitely pick up in this time. It was all about staying home and cooking for your family, and convenience options really did quite well where possible. Smaller online retailers, I know that I attempted to order for a few of those. Some of them were able to supply and some weren't, but some of them have been very clever with their marketing as soon as they come back into stock. And I think that's a trend that we'll see continue. Contactless payment and delivery has become the norm for retailers. And as I mentioned before, we really see this premium and mainstream divide with shoppers who are insulated and want perhaps a little bit of luxury to brighten their week, versus those shoppers who are a bit more constrained economically and will be looking for the mainstream, the value products. And again, natural and local. And just more than ever, shoppers are after understanding the supply chain, and they want a bit more transparency in the future and measures being taken to assure their safety. So looking at dairy in particular, dairy had a great peak in March that was in line with what we've seen in total grocery. Now it has tapered off a little bit in April that we saw, and I'm looking at the blue lines there. The light blue is the current sales and the dark blue is the sales a year ago. So you can see we're still significantly up versus the same time a year ago. And again, that stay at home retail sales are up across many commodities. For the last 12 weeks, we can see that volume sales of dairy have increased by 6.2% and a dollar sale increase of 15.4%. And let's take a look at the different departments making up that growth. As I mentioned before, we definitely saw a spike in things like long life milk and non-dairy milk, and that spiked significantly in March. However, in April, that really tapered off as people started to work through the existing stocks they had at home. Fresh milk has got a bit of a boost. I know that's a small percentage increase, but it is off an incredibly large base. And we certainly saw a spike in at-home coffee products, and fresh milk will go along with that spike. From a cheese perspective, we saw everyday cheese really coming in and staying strong in growth through both March and April. And that's, I guess, having the family at home and wanting to feed them. Entertaining cheese saw a bit of a dive in April, and that's with the Easter comparison to the same Easter last year. Easter not such an entertaining time period this year. And butter has really been a standout in terms of growth, with all the home cooking and home baking coming in. We've really seen that come through strongly in both March and April. Ice cream was an interesting one. I expected ice cream as one of life's little indulgences to come through quite strongly in March, but I guess as people were stocking up their freezers with the essentials, such as frozen fruit, frozen veg, stocking up their freezers with mince and things like that they could cook for dinner, ice cream really did take a bit of a tumble in March, however came back very strongly in April as freezer space freed up. So what does the future look like from a grocery perspective for short, medium and long term? When we surveyed Europeans and Australians, most believe that the impact of COVID-19 is here to stay for the next 12 months. When we look at dairy in particular, and we break our shoppers into these insulated spenders versus these constrained spenders, we can see that from an insulated spender, we can expect in the short, medium and the long term, which are the three arrows there on the chart, that the increases will be this for dairy will be across the short and the medium term, and in the long term for insulated spenders will start to stabilise. Constrained spenders over the long term, we do expect to see a decline in this spend on dairy as they seek out those value options. So we really believe when we consider the impact of employment across the short, medium and long term horizons, we can see that yes, there has been this government bailout and so people have got some money, but we expect in the next 9 to 12 month horizon, many small businesses will be unable to carry on. The number of people taking pay cuts or salary decreases will increase. And we believe all of this will just intensify that focus on value products and cheap staples. We think that consumers will demand more precautions everywhere, and that's already started to happen. You can see that at your local supermarket today. Feel that they'll gravitate to open rather than confined spaces. We really see this push to assist and support local brands coming through, and with businesses, communities, from both a brand and a retailer perspective. We see this trend of creating a home haven and that homebody economy that's already started to be in place for many Australians, but we see that continuing. We also think that transparency will be paramount from both retailer perspective, but also a brand perspective in building trust with consumers. So supply chain, production transparency, all of that sort of thing, and honest communication to build trust. We do see that successful retailers and successful suppliers will be leveraging technology where they can to really build on that huge online thrust we've seen over the past few months. And finally, to finish off, from an overall perspective, one thing that Sam raised in her discussion was social mindedness and how COVID has highlighted the importance of social cooperation and created a community with an idea of something bigger. We really believe that COVID has proven we can work collaborating with government, retailers and companies, and this is creating hope for us that we can tackle bigger issues such as climate change and income equality in the future. So thank you. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, thanks very much, Melanie. There's just one brief point of clarification. I think it was the difference between a constrained and insulated spender or insulated group. So I think you were noting.
So an insulated spender is someone who can really buy what they want. They're probably someone who hasn't had any employment consequences of COVID-19, and they're typically higher income spenders. The constrained spender is typically a lower income spender, and they may have had employment challenges as a result of COVID-19, and we certainly see those having more employment challenges.
Thank you very much. So Melanie, I think that what we might do now actually is, rather than direct questions at you, we just might open it up
Sure.
to any questions anyone's got that they would like to direct to either Melanie or Sam, or any questions that they would like to raise or comments that they would like to make during this last part of the time that we have together. So please feel free to put your comments in or questions in, and we'll take it from there. So anyone with any questions? Sorry, if you're like me, who's a very slow typist, it takes you a while to get your questions in. Feel free. If not, while I'm waiting for people to put their questions in, perhaps I could ask Melanie, you and Sam. So Sam, you were sort of raising the point that really what lessons from COVID-19 is that it's actually going to accelerate a lot of the issues that we're starting to think about, the climate issues, the impacts on our way of life, the need for us to do things, the importance for us to actually make a lot of the goals more personal rather than just to see them as global goals. And Melanie, you've translated that into, again, as shoppers, what that means. We've really taken much more interest in shopping for family, shopping to survive, shopping to ensure that we can get through this. Do you see that, you did talk about a lot of those trends are going to be here to stay. How do you see that connecting? I know you made the comment that sustainability and some of the other areas seem to be pushed out, and that it's mostly, have I got enough food? Is it local? Can I trust it, etc., became the driving forces. When do you see that crossover moving into, Sam, the realm that you had about people starting to think about longer term? What do we need to be doing to ensure that we can survive whatever comes after where we're at now? So maybe, Sam, firstly for you, as in the sort of the personal indications, and then Mel, how you see that translating.
Yeah, thanks, Helen. Look, I was really grateful to be able to see the actual data from Melanie on what's really happening with consumers, and that all feels exactly, I think, the way we have been experiencing that part of the personally felt crisis. But Melanie's last comment on people wanting over time to have greater certainty about where things are coming from, the guarantee of safety and how things are produced, I think that's the sign that we're moving into a much more evolved community that's seeing all sorts of crises around. I think back to this human health issue, we saw it through the fires. People before the fires, when the smoke was just getting to such extreme levels, for the first time, consumers and community members in Australia felt what it was like to live in Shanghai or in those highly polluted cities, and suddenly had an indication that human health and the relationship we have with industry and with our landscapes is terribly important. And the EPA in Victoria has reported that they can't keep up with the demand for air quality control devices across the Victorian landscape, from communities wanting to know what is their air quality now, because of that increasing knowledge about the quality of air quality during that time. And so I think we're becoming more alive to those kind of threats that affect our human health, the health of our children and our communities. And I think that's going to start to translate into decisions about brands to support and organisations to support. But I think, to Melanie's point, it may not be specifically at the checkout. I think it will be more about who do we trust, and that trust we saw from the global trust indicators around Christmas, that the trust in governments had dropped and had risen in business, and looking for business leadership and industry leadership to help people navigate this tough time. And I suspect government trust has risen in this period where there's been a lot more working together with communities. And so I think that level of trust is now going to be something that communities want to see action on. So if they trust us, what are you going to do to win that trust? So I think at an industry level, to continue to talk about good sourcing, supply chain, the animal rights issues, the things that have become important to people, become part of your storytelling about why you stick with this industry. and a particular focus for Australia, I think in terms of our export capacity, we will be, I suspect, one of the most trusted food providers and manufacturers relative to the rest of the world that's stuck in these terrible, not just economic, but production halts. So I think our general trust in us as a country to deliver some of the products that come out of this sector will rise and provide new opportunities for new markets, I'd hope. But that's a very general view versus Melanie's very clear understanding of what's happening with consumers as they make their purchases.
Yeah, Sam, I was so transfixed by your answer, Sam, I nearly forgot the question, but I think the question is how, Helen, actually, would you like to just repeat the question? Oh.
Take myself off mute.
Yeah, you're on mute.
Sorry, how many times do we all do that? Sorry about that. It was really more just looking at the comments that Sam was making about you know, the increasing focus, the need to do things in a shorter time frame, and to actually start thinking about some of those things that we've looked at, and then how does that then, do you see that translating into the food space?
That's right, thank you. Yeah, look, we see that happening more in the longer term, you know, perhaps after that 6 to 12 months where people have gotten through the initial panic. But I think to a certain extent that's going to depend on the amount of noise that groups and companies and government make about these things, that bring them to people's attention once again and just reminding them. I mean, I know myself, just thinking on a very basic and low level, every time I go to the coffee shop, I'm horrified that I can't use a keep cup, for example, on a very small sustainable level. And that horrifies me every time. But how long is it going to take me to get used to it and me to stop asking if I can use one, for example, you know? So we see that happening in the 12 months, but I do think that consumers will need to be reminded about these things and just have it brought to their attention again.
Thank you. We've had a few questions come through, and just, Oscar, sorry, you were asking about a survey the NFF's doing, so if you'd like to share that with the people on this one, that would be great. So there was one more, or there's been a few coming on about, you know, the transparency, the need for people wanting to know more about purchasing, remaining data suggesting, a move away from individualism to more about collective outcomes. We've been seeing that, where people are actually starting to think more about looking after others. There's also about the touch points around transparency. What is it that actually people are looking for when we talk about transparent chains, transparent food supply? Is it around quality and safety, or is it those other things? You did touch a little bit on that, Sam, but do you see that, as you said, Australian food may well be one of the most trusted? Is it more around those criteria of safety and quality and security rather than necessarily some of the other attributes? You might like to comment.
I suspect those attributes are all blending together a lot, that the notion of food safety or food security takes you straight to a transparent information about how the food is actually developed, what is the quality of the soil, what additives are used, are people paid a good wage in the production of that food? All of those things are becoming, I mean, the fact that we've got a Modern Slavery Act in Australia and we've never really thought about a country having slavery tells us something about where things have moved quite dramatically, that there is now a regulation around the misuse of people in your supply chain. And I think what people have learned, possibly through shutdown, but also thinking about what's really challenging our sense of our health and well-being and the future of our health and well-being for our children, our grandchildren, is that something's going wrong in that system that we've got to fix. And so the question earlier about inequalities takes me there, is that, you know, there'll be people in Australia who can't access good quality food because they can't afford it. And the transparency around how we distribute food more fairly, what is the role of an industry around that versus government or the charitable sector, I think all those things come together to determine whether you trust an industry and its engagement with the community now that we understand that we are in this together. And there are other industries that are really trying hard to deal with this, whether it's on climate or on how they're sourcing. We've seen big changes in the fashion industry and purchasing decisions being made on where is the material coming from, where's the labour, and how is that proved? I mean, my husband bought a jumper while we've been in lockdown, on the basis that it was a New Zealand jumper that was manufactured, that wool came from New Zealand, manufactured in Italy and delivered via another country, and it's a zero carbon jumper, and it has an ID on it that you can scan to find where that sheep is today, how it's being looked after, and the quality of the fibre that came to you, and the sort of transparency of the operation of that wool farm. And that's a really interesting way of thinking about wearing a jumper and knowing exactly where it's come from and telling people you can test it at any time. Now that's probably very much in the insulated consumer category at the moment, and a luxury. But I think more and more people do want to know where things have come from to determine a purchase, and hopefully that moves down into those that have less control over their budgets to be about actually sourcing good quality things for the health and safety of their families.
And Melanie, just to back that up too, there was another question which comes to that point, is about, do you think people are going to value food more and perhaps try to waste less, etc., or do you think this is a passing trend?
Yeah, look, that's another great question. And I do think absolutely people are valuing food more, and the simple pleasures in life are really coming through much more, you know, time with family, cooking the family meal, you know, using up all your leftovers and that sort of thing. One thing I do worry about though is the sustainable, the transparency, the local origin stuff normally comes with a price tag, and we're going to have a lot of these constrained spenders and they're going to be seeking value options. So I think it's important, as Sam mentioned, that we need to find a way of working together and getting those products at a value rate, but with those nice attributes that we want to see more of and that we need to see more of in our food chain.
And I think that goes to an opportunity, just reading through the material on what you've already committed to with sustainability practices from the farm all the way through, and the way you've actually reported that. It strikes me that you don't want other people to solve your industry issues, you want to solve them yourselves. And there are other sectors that have had really hard to deal with problems, where they've had to reach out to others to get a cooperative effort to solve a problem, whether it's a reduction in methane gas or making things more available to all buyers. But those other industries have stopped thinking they can only solve it within their own industry. And I think some of that generosity in sitting down with people who may not have been in your thoughts originally about how to solve a problem is what we're seeing in other sectors trying to get to grips with really, really difficult problems. And if you're not solving it, someone else in the world is trying to solve it and may impose that on you through some kind of disruption. And I think that what I sort of observe in Australia is the need for us to be much more collaborative within and around industries to help solve some of these things quickly, using technology, but getting good grasp of what that challenge is, and that things can be fixed, but will require much more outreach to people who can help with that, the parts of that problem that don't necessarily sit within your industry.
Thank you. And just for the last question, I'm sorry everyone, there's been a few questions coming through. It was really more, what's your view on investors, Sam? So as an industry, we obviously are always keen to have investment into the industry. Food and air at times is seen as quite a risky investment process. Do you see that maybe changing after the last few months?
Yeah, absolutely. This is the great moment to grab as an industry, to open up a different level of conversation with your investors and the people who bank you. The reason I use the bank example about ING putting an X-ray over its mortgage book or its loans book is it's the banking system, and in Australia this is coming. Banks now want to know that they're on the hook for the impact that their customers that they're banking are now involved in, and they want to be part of that. They're increasingly measuring it and being judged on that. This is the perfect time for an industry to go back into the banking system and to investors, to the superannuation industry, and say, if we're going to be a sustainable investment, we need to take you on a journey of what we care about, why we're investable, how we deal with that risk that you perceive, and how we're part of a more global commitment to fixing some of these big issues. Because certainly from an investor and banking system, the commitments to zero carbon have become very real, and big investors are moving big amounts of money, as are superannuation funds, into those businesses and industries they really believe are going to be able to manage these challenges to net zero, and turning their back on those that have got high carbon, no plan for the future, and thinking short term. So it's an opportunity to grab, to actually have that reverse conversation back up into your investment arms and the banks that support you, because they're up for this, and they're on the hook with regulators. You've got all of the major prudential regulators now checking in to make sure that investments do meet these criteria around issues like climate change. social inequality, a number of other factors. So I would grab that one and open up those conversations if you possibly can.
Thank you. I'm very sorry, everyone. We're going to have to finish up. So everyone has lots of other commitments. It's been a really great discussion. I'll turn to Chris in a minute. But again, just to let you know that we will capture all the questions that have come in, and we'll go through those. But just, Sam, quickly, you pointed out the acceleration of all the mega trends now with COVID-19 showing that where there's a will, there's a way, that if people are really determined to do something, it can happen in the space of a very short time. And that we also need to make sure that we are constantly looking at that resilience and creating the need for people to actually start thinking about how they're going to do things differently. And Melanie, you were talking particularly about consumers, whether staying at home has become a new way of life, or whether once we're all free, we'll all get out and go and do other things. That you know, people looking at different options, have tried new things while they've been at home, and maybe that will become the new norm rather than necessarily going back. And that there will be increasing recognition of the value of food. So they're the sort of couple of key messages that I took out of it. I now might just turn to Chris, if you're still online, Chris, with your mobile, to talk very briefly with wrapping up the webinar.
Thanks, Helen. Yes, I am here, and I have been a little bit hamstrung due to the fact that I couldn't see any of the slides, but I've made a commitment to myself to try and improve that before the next one. But certainly, on behalf of the group here, to Sam and Melanie, thank you very much for your presentations, and by the sound of things, generated quite a lot of discussion and questions that, as Helen said, we'll capture and work through. And I just, yeah, it was heartening initially, Sam, that you recognised the work that we've done on our framework and the line SDGs. Yeah, we worked fairly hard to make sure that we're on top of things and continually analysing or refreshing our information so that we are really a relevant framework for the industry. I'll leave it at that. I'm not sure, Helen, but once again, all everyone that's come online, we have got a number of these coming on, and hopefully we'll have as equally as great a participation, if not more, into the future. But thank you one and all, and stay safe. Back to you, Helen.
Okay, thank you, Chris. And just to finalise, so thank you again, Sam and Melanie. So we will send a link to the recording of this webinar for anyone who wants to just check any of the information that came out of it. And also, as I said, there's a few other people who weren't able to be here today who would like to listen to it. We'll also keep a recording of the questions, and any that we didn't get a chance to address during this webinar today, we will follow up with you. And if anyone has any questions that occur to them after this, please don't hesitate to send them in. The next webinar that we'll have will be one where we actually start to look a bit more in detail about some of the things that are happening against our 4 commitments. So we're starting off with our commitment to managing the challenge of climate change and being good environmental stewards, and getting an overview of what's happening in the wider world from Ian McConnell from the World Wildlife Fund. And then we'll talk briefly about what's happening with Kath Leskin and one of our projects about scarce water and how we're dealing with it. That will be a new experiment for us, where we will actually go into breakout rooms. So for all of you, you'll have the chance, rather than me having you all muted and no screens on, we'll put you into breakout groups. You'll have the chance to talk to others so that we can get your feedback more directly. So thanks everyone, and we'll send you around the link, and I really appreciate you all taking the time. So thank you very much.